Hi, everyone. We are, excuse me, at the top of the hour, so I think we'll get started. I do see that there are some additional attendees joining. So really appreciate you all being with us. I'm Ben Castleman. I'm a professor at Batten, as well as the School of Education at UVA, joined by my colleagues, Gaby Lohner and Kelli Bird. And we are very excited to share with you work that we have done recently looking at the effects of the abrupt shift to online education from this past spring due to COVID on students' academic performance. We're really excited to have a range of participants in this chat. I know we have some students joining, parents, I think deans and perhaps others. And I imagine all of you in one fashion or another can relate to and still have very strong and poignant memories of what that shift was like in mid-March, where whether it was as a student having to switch to online, a parent supporting your college student to make that shift, or if you still had students at home, of course, supporting them in remote instruction, or on the faculty or administrator side, supporting as high quality instruction as we could to the shift to the online environment. I think it's without controversy to say that that abrupt shift to online learning brought about one of the most massive disruptions in the history of American education. And again, the scale of that disruption was unprecedented. Tens of millions of students, teachers, parents in the space of short weeks had to make this really sizable change to the approach to schooling. Our focus in the 30 minutes or so that we have together is how that abrupt shift to online learning affected students' academic performance in the spring 2020 semester. We are focusing particularly on effects in higher education, and we're not going to be focusing on the University of Virginia, but rather on Virginia's community colleges for a couple of reasons. One, community colleges enroll almost half, about 40% of all students in the country. By comparison, really elite institutions like UVA enroll about 3% of all students. And so if we're interested in the broad question of how did this abrupt shift to online learning affect students, the focus on the community college is going to get us closer to impacts for the majority of college-going students in the United States. The other reason we focus on community colleges is really from an equity and an inequality perspective. Community colleges, by virtue of being open enrollment institutions, meaning anyone who applies can go, disproportionately enroll lower income and first-generation students who we know from lots of emerging work have borne the brunt of the economic, health, and childcare challenges due to COVID. And so we're particularly interested on how students who are in community colleges and navigating these other challenges associated with COVID, how that affected them academically. Our approach, we're not going to go into a lot of the technical details on how we evaluate the impact of COVID. We are happy to share a paper and in fact, can put a link to that in chat where we go into all the nitty-gritty technical details. And if you're interested, we're also, of course, happy to answer questions you might have on that. But at an intuitive level, what we're doing is using an evaluation strategy that lets us isolate the impact of the abrupt shift to from in-person to online learning on students' academic performance, separate from the effects that all of the other concurrent changes, job loss, health challenges, increased childcare responsibilities at home, would have had on students' academic performance. Gaby's going to give you a visual, intuitive overview of our approach. And again, our paper shares all the technical details. But our hope is that using this particular approach to evaluation lets us really zero in on the effect of the abrupt shift to online instruction and how that affected students' academic performance. Our goal in this analysis is both to begin contributing to the research literature on how COVID affected students' academic outcomes. Ours is the first paper we know of, at least, that gets at this abrupt shift to online learning and how it affects academic outcomes. But we also very much have an eye towards the very complex and challenging decisions that colleges and universities are making across the country right now, weighing, of course, most importantly, the public health considerations of being in person or virtual, but also hopefully factoring into those complex considerations, how shifts to online might impact students academically. And so our hope is that our results inform and contribute to, again, what we recognize are very complex and difficult decisions that colleges and universities are making. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-author and colleague, Gaby Lohner, who again will give you an intuitive visual overview of how we go about isolating the unique effect of this abrupt shift to online learning, and then we'll share with you what we find.
Great, thanks, Ben. So as Ben mentioned, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, show you all some graphs. Great. Hi, everyone. So as Ben mentioned, we are looking to isolate the impact of this move to online courses on course completion for students at Virginia's community colleges. The way that we do this is by comparing two groups of students. So you can see these are the two lines in this graph. We have in-person students and online students. So this graph is looking at the past 4 spring semesters, not including spring 2020. And as we can see, we're looking at course completion here on the y-axis. So we see that students who were enrolled in in-person courses seem to be completing courses at slightly higher rates than students who were enrolled at online courses at these community colleges. But the important thing that we're looking at here is the fact that these lines seem to move together. So as the students who are taking in-person courses are seeing increased completion rates, so are the students who are taking online courses. And we're going to use this consistent relationship in prior terms to look at the impact of switching those in-person courses to online courses. So as Ben mentioned, COVID affected students in a variety of ways, health-wise, finances, childcare, all of these different effects. But the thing we want to zero in on is the fact that only one of these two groups of students had a change in their course delivery. So that was these in-person students who all of their courses got moved online, while the students who were enrolled in these online courses at the beginning of the spring 2020 semester had no change in their course delivery. And so when we look at what this looks like for the spring 2020 semester, we do see a decrease in course completion for the in-person students, and we actually see an increase in course completion for the online students. This is likely due to the fact that, like UVA and a lot of other schools, the community colleges switched to a pass-fail grading system, and there was probably a little bit of leniency in instructor grading due to the crazy circumstances of the spring 2020 semester. So what we see here is around a 5% increase in course completion for the students who were taking courses online, around a 3% decrease in course completion for the students who started the spring 2020 semester in person. So that adds up to around an 8% negative impact of the shift from in-person to online learning. So we can look at these numbers a bit more specifically. As I just mentioned, our estimate for the impact of moving from in-person to online courses is a negative 8.5% decrease in course completion for students. We also wanted to look at whether this impact was either mitigated or even made worse by instructor experience teaching online. And so in these two bars, in this first bar, we're going to look at specifically the courses taught by instructors who were teaching the same course in the spring 2020 semester online and in person. The idea being that they were already teaching this course online, so maybe that shift is a little bit easier for them. And what we find is the estimate is basically the same as our overall estimate, a negative 8.8% decrease in course completion for those students. And then the flip side of that, we look at the instructors who were only teaching in-person courses in spring 2020. So maybe these were the instructors who would have struggled a bit more with that move to online courses since they weren't teaching online. And again, we find a pretty similar impact, negative 7.9% in course completion for students who were taking courses with those instructors. And all of this sort of tells us that instructor experience teaching online doesn't seem to have had a very big impact on this move to online courses. And it seems that the struggle with the move to online was more on the student side rather than based on instructor experience. And then we also looked at how this affected different groups of students based on their academic standing. So these two bars were looking first at students who have 0 credits completed coming into the spring 2020 semester. So this is either students who were enrolled in courses previously and either failed or withdrew from all those courses, or students who this is their first semester enrolled at the community college. And for those students, we actually see a negative 12.5% decrease in course completion when we compare that to the students who had 30 or more credits, so students who were a bit further along in their academic careers in spring 2020. The effect for those students was around half at 6.3% decrease in course completion. Then we also look at these impacts based on student GPA. So we take the students with the lowest 1/3 on the GPA distribution, and those students have a negative 15.5% decrease in course completion due to the move to online courses. When we compare that to the students with the highest 1/3 of GPAs, those students only experience a negative 3.6% decrease in course completion. So all of these findings sort of point to the fact that while on average, all students were negatively impacted by the shift to online courses, the students who were most affected were those who were either already struggling in school or those who have just started out their college careers. And we think that might have some important implications moving forward. So I will hand it off to Kelly to discuss some of those.
Thanks, Gabby. So when thinking about how to translate this type of research into real world implications, I try and think through 3 stages, like what we learned from the study, if there are any limitations that to what we learned, and then what we still don't know, and therefore what we think is important for future study and future policy conversations. So Gabby just did a great job at explaining what we learned from the study. Students who had a shift from in-person to virtual learning due to COVID were less likely to complete a course. And because we use the comparison group of students already enrolled online, this negative impact is due solely to the shift in instructional modality. So what we're capturing here isn't any of the health or economic impacts. And this impact appears to be driven by the students' struggles as opposed to any difficulties that instructors faced with the transitions. Not to say that instructors didn't face any difficulties, but that doesn't appear to be driving the impact. And we also see that the negative impacts were largest for students with either no prior college experience or those with poor academic performance in the past. There are two important limitations to be mindful of. One, which Gabby mentioned, is that BCCS, along with most other colleges and universities, had an emergency grading policy where students were either pass, withdrawal, or incomplete. And this was also likely coupled with instructors being a bit more generous in their grading. And so that means we can't really be sure what the impact would have been if students were subject to normal grading policies. Like we saw that increase in course completion for online students, and that's probably due to the more favorable grading policies. So what we see, our results is more of a lower bound on what the true impact would have been if, say, for example, that emergency grading policy hadn't been in place. The second limitation of our study thus far is that we can only speak to the short-term impacts. We're only focusing on, the impacts of course completion within the spring 2020 semester, which is just going to be one of the weirdest terms in higher education history, I think. But we do know that we think that this impact is still ongoing, right? Because as we all know, the majority of higher education courses are still being taught online, and that might well continue into 2021. So finally, I'll share some thoughts on what we think is important to consider for future research and policy conversations. In our study, we didn't try and quantify the cost, like in dollar terms, of the decrease in learning, and make that direct comparison to health risks of moving back to in-person courses. There's two issues right now with doing that. One is, it's definitely a subjective question of how to measure the cost of the negative impact. You can measure in a number of ways: wasted tuition dollars, lost in future earnings for students who aren't completing their courses. And then also on the flip side, on the other side of the cost benefit equation, is we still don't fully understand the health risks of moving back to in-person classrooms, and the cost of all of the necessary precautionary measures. And that's definitely outside of our sort of wheelhouse as education researchers to be able to come up with those costs. But it's something that can definitely be accounted for in future work. We also, in our study, we weren't able to provide any evidence on how colleges can improve their online learning environments to make them sort of more like the in-person learning environments, to increase the learning and engagement of students, particularly among those lower performing students and the new students who are most impacted. I will say that our colleagues, Diju and others at UC Irvine are going to be looking more at this specifically, using data from the Canvas online learning environment and trying to identify instructional practices that are related to better student outcomes. So definitely be on the lookout for that. And then the last point that I'll make, and then I'll open it up for questions, is we don't know how the shift to online learning and really the whole year of 2020 is going to impact the higher education landscape as a whole, but we expect that there will be and continue to be a near to midterm impact in terms of who is and who isn't enrolling in higher education, maybe what courses of study that they're pursuing, what institutions they're enrolling at. There's definitely going to be just a mountain of research coming out to address those questions in the coming months and years. So definitely be on the lookout for that. And with that, I can wrap up and open it up for questions.
Great, thanks, Kelly. And I'm happy to moderate the conversation. We'd love to hear your questions or reactions. Please feel free I see that some folks are starting to submit those through the Q&A feature. Please continue to do so. We will get to as many questions as we can in the 10 or so minutes that we have. Any we don't get to, we're happy to follow up with you individually. And if you want to reach out to us coming out of this call, I'm sure I speak for Gaby and Kelly in saying we'd be happy to be in touch. So the first question is a very interesting one. Do you think hybrid learning, online and in person, will continue after COVID? And how will this affect the future of higher ed? Maybe I'll take a first stab and then see if Kelly or Gaby want to add anything. One of the really interesting things to note, and this was a bit apparent in what Gaby presented, but it was also a little subtle, is that at the community college level, again, which is 40% of all higher education enrollments, online has already been a pretty robust presence for quite a long time. Schools like UVA are more the outlier in higher education in still having comparatively few, pre-COVID, excuse me, comparatively few online classes. And so online has been quite prevalent in higher education. I think that will continue. And I think it is an interesting question about what will happen at places like UVA. As someone who's teaching a large class fully online this semester, I will say for myself, I think there's a very steep learning curve that I have experienced in terms of how to be effective pedagogically online. And so to the extent there are requirements or opportunities to continue hybrid or online, at least for myself, I imagine for some of my colleagues, I think that'll require continued pedagogic effort to figure out how to make online as high quality a learning experience as in person. And I think our results speak to that. Kelli or Gaby, anything you want to add to that first question? I'm going to turn it to one of you to answer the second question. So
I guess if anyone is feeling the need to look on the bright side, I mean, this is sort of piggybacking on what Ben was saying. You know, hopefully, what will happen from all of this shift to online is, you know, better online learning options and instructors having better tools provided by their colleagues, their departments, their colleges to help them facilitate this online learning. Because you know, even before COVID, like online learning was really ramping up within the higher education field, particularly at community colleges. So you know, there's a bright side is that there might be it might be end up being a good thing for online learning in the long run.
yeah, great point. Let's go on to the second question, and I'll see if Kelli or Gaby want to speak to this before I do. The second question is, what do we think the most significant long-term impacts will be from this shift to online learning? Kelli, you alluded just now to I think, reasonable silver lining view that we might actually see better online pedagogy because so many of us have been forced to grapple with teaching online in a way that we didn't pre-COVID. Curious if you or Gaby see other, you know, potentially long-term impacts of this, the ongoing abrupt shift to online learning because of COVID.
I mean, it's an excellent question. I think, I think that the long-term impacts are much harder to anticipate as opposed to the nearer to midterm. You know, what we've seen and heard from our partners at the community colleges is that at least in the next couple of years, it seems like there will be more students who would have gone to four-year universities or perhaps more expensive universities who are opting to stay at community colleges or you know, opt for a public four-year as opposed to a more expensive private four-year, and so that could have longer term impacts on the higher education system as a whole as students are making those shifts. So I think that's probably the largest impact that comes to mind. It's hard to anticipate though what exactly that is going to mean for the system. But yeah, Gaby, any extra thoughts?
Yeah, I would just add, you know, in this study, we were able to sort of look at the difference between the effect of COVID and the effect of online learning. And I think going forward, like Kelli mentioned, that's going to become even harder. You know, there might be students who change their enrollment decisions because they know that courses are going to be offered online and they don't want to take those courses. And then there might be students who change their enrollment decisions because, you know, parents lost a job or they lost a job and they won't be able to afford going to school, or, you know, something health related that has to do with COVID. So I think going forward, we're going to have to really think about how to disentangle the impact of the pandemic that we have no idea what that's going to look like in the coming months, and then the change to the higher education system.
And I'll build on that just for a moment and then get to the third question we have so far. You know, in the research work and the policy engagement work we do, our primary focus is on reducing socioeconomic and other forms of inequality in education in the workplace and increasing educational and economic opportunities for traditionally underrepresented populations. one of my big concerns, and I imagine this is shared by others on the chat, is the equity implications of the shift to online learning. And I experienced this in my own teaching, and I think we will likely find this borne out in additional research, that students from more privileged and affluent backgrounds have various cushions under them that mitigate the challenges of transitioning to online, right? Reliable Wi-Fi is a very concrete example. Less likelihood that a family member has experienced COVID or a severe case of COVID-19. Less likelihood of a family member experiencing a substantial job loss or economic shock. On the flip side, and again, this is my direct experience teaching a large class of undergraduates this semester, students who are from lower income backgrounds, the first in their family to go to college, I think are going to tend to be much more likely to not have reliable internet, to have a family member who's struggling because of COVID related complications, to have experienced themselves or to have a family member lost a job. And so we've already had substantial inequality for higher education for a long time. I worry COVID has only exacerbated that. And in my view, that just increases the onus and responsibility on us as faculty members, as institutions, and as governments at the local, state, and federal level to double down on the investments we make to support and strengthen opportunity for students who are struggling in the face of COVID. Switching to the benefits, I'm glad that someone asked this question, or what are the actual benefits of online learning? And again, I will speak from my teaching experience this semester. In a large class, one of the things I've really appreciated from an asynchronous learning environment is that I actually have much more opportunity to interact individually with the ideas and insights and perspectives of individual students. Any of you who have taught or been on the student side in a large class know that absent asynchronous learning opportunities, if there's one professor at the front of the room, even if they're moving around and hundreds of students, there's always in the space of that environment going to be fairly limited opportunity for direct instruction. And I will say, at least for myself as a faculty member pre-COVID, I probably didn't create enough opportunities for asynchronous outside of class engagement. That's become a necessity in COVID. And so through individual reflections, through Canvas or small or collab or small group discussions, I feel like I have opportunity for more direct and ongoing engagement with students. And my guess is there are some students who would not participate as frequently in a in-person verbal discussion, but whose insights are tremendously profound and thought-provoking in the digital online environment. So I see that as a real benefit. I want to be mindful that we have 2 minutes remaining in this chat. Again, I'll emphasize that we'd be happy to connect with you following. Are there any other questions that anyone would like to pose in the minute or so that we have?
I think we might have one in the chat, Ben. I don't know if you saw that.
Thanks, Gaby. I did not see that. So let me switch where I'm viewing. So Daniel's question, does our research suggest that instructors need to focus more intensely on new and lower performing students to promote greater course completion? And how would they go about doing that? That's a really interesting question, Daniel. Our results, if Gaby and Kelly don't mind, I'll answer just limited time. Our results certainly suggest that those groups of students struggled more with the shift to online. I think it's potentially a corollary that additional faculty investment in students, in students from those subgroups could lead to better performance. Ultimately, that's the kind of empirical question we like to investigate through our research and engagement work. And as Kelly alluded, we're partnering with some colleagues at the University of California, Irvine, both to first kind of descriptively document instructional practices that appear to be effective just in a correlational sense. For any of the students, we can see the correlation of instructional practices and student outcomes. And so if we see that there are certain practices instructors are doing that lead to better outcomes for new students or lower performing students, our approach tends to then be to evaluate those practices experimentally, where we might randomly assign students to specific practices and see how that affects outcomes. So that maybe is a bit of a teaser to talk more about our approach to research and engagement to generate evidence of effective practice. Maybe I'll leave everyone with that as an invitation to reach out if you'd like to talk more. And again, I want to thank everyone for joining. I certainly want to thank our Aaron and Millie and the rest of the Batten communications team for creating the environment of these expert chats, for folks like us to share the work we're doing. And I certainly extend a warm thanks to all of you for joining. So we hope to be in touch with some of you after, and thank you so much for being on the chat with us today.